Hey everyone, welcome back to FantasyGleam. Imagine a disease so deadly, it wiped out half of Europe. But the deadliest part wasn't just the plague itself. It was humanity's desperate, bizarre attempts to fight it. In this episode of Boring History to Sleep, we'll travel through medieval streets, into sealed castles, and even inside the minds of doctors who believed masks, herbs, and burning rosewater could save them. Stay with me as we uncover the chilling, fascinating, and sometimes strangely funny story of the Black Death, all in calm, detailed narration perfect for falling asleep or staying riveted. In the markets and caravanserais along the bustling Silk Road, merchants spoke in hushed tones of a sickness unlike any they had seen before. At first, it was dismissed as mere rumor, the kind of traveler's tale meant to amuse or frighten. A coughing sickness, they said, that blackens the skin and takes breath in a single night. The merchants' stories, carried over deserts, mountains, and rivers, reached distant lands with each passing caravan. Yet for those who heard them, a chill ran deeper than the winter wind. There was an unspoken fear in their words, a trembling that whispered of doom long before it arrived. Rats, those silent companions of human settlements, were the first to betray the truth. Along the trade routes, merchants noticed the creatures dying in unusual numbers. Some fell in the streets, twitching as if the world itself had betrayed them. Others disappeared entirely, leaving behind an eerie silence in the corners of storerooms and the shadows of warehouses. Villagers, accustomed to the occasional plague of vermin, shrugged it off at first. Yet, a subtle dread settled in the hearts of the people. When the rats die, the world that survives begins to tremble. It was in the year 1347 that the rumors found their way to the shores of the Mediterranean. Sicily, a jewel of trade and culture, welcomed fleets from Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. Ships arrived heavy with goods, exotic spices, silks, and grains, but among their cargo, hidden beneath barrels and crates, lurked a silent, invisible enemy. Sailors, gaunt and coughing, staggered on deck, their eyes sunken, their skin mottled with strange blackened spots. They whispered about fever, weakness, and death as though telling a story no one wanted to hear. The townsfolk, eager for commerce and unaware of the danger, rushed to assist the weary travelers. They offered food, water, and shelter, never imagining that kindness could be a doorway for devastation. Children ran along the docks, laughing and chasing seagulls, oblivious to the shadows of disease creeping along the wooden planks. Merchants carried crates into warehouses, stacking them carefully, never noticing the tiny passengers clinging to their goods, fleas, hidden and patient, waiting to begin their grim work. For a while, life continued as usual. Festivals were celebrated, church bells rang, and the scent of fresh bread mingled with the salty tang of the sea. Yet beneath the veneer of normality, the first signs of death began to creep silently into daily life. Rats began falling in the alleyways, their bodies a silent warning no one yet understood. Dogs sniffed the streets uneasily. Cats disappeared from homes. The locals shrugged, rationalized, and prayed, unaware that the whisper from the east had already crossed the seas and taken root in their town. By the end of the month, the first human casualties appeared. A fisherman collapsed while hauling in his nets. A merchant keeled over in the market, clutching his chest. Panic simmered beneath the surface, but fear had not yet taken hold. Not until the black spots appeared, spreading across skin like ink on parchment, a mark of a fate no one could escape. Stories of strange illnesses that came from the east were no longer just tales. They were living nightmares. And so, in the quiet of a Mediterranean dawn, the world teetered on the edge of a shadow it could not yet name. The whispers of the Silk Road, carried across mountains and deserts, had arrived in Sicily. It was only the beginning, the first page of a story that would stretch across Europe, devouring towns, families, and centuries of life, leaving behind a lesson in fear, desperation, and human fragility that no one alive could fully comprehend. The stage was set, the invisible enemy had arrived, and history itself began to tremble at the whispers from the east. The port of Messina buzzed with the usual flurry of activity. Merchants shouted over the clamor of creaking rigging. Sailors carried sacks of grain and crates of silk, and the scent of salt and fish mingled with the heady aroma of spices from distant lands. For centuries, Messina had thrived as a crossroads of trade, a city where wealth, opportunity, and rumor flowed in equal measure. But in the spring of 1347, the city's prosperity brought with it a shadow that would not be ignored. 12 Genoese ships appeared on the horizon, their sails tattered, their hulls weathered by months at sea. From a distance, they seemed ordinary, just another fleet of merchants arriving with the promise of exotic goods. But as they drew closer, a subtle unease rippled through the dockworkers. Something was wrong. The first bodies appeared on deck. Sailors slumped against the railings, their faces pale and mottled with dark, almost black spots. Others coughed violently, spitting blood into the salt water as if the sea itself had turned against them. Their moans carried over the waves, unsettling even the hardened dockhands. Curiosity and fear warred in the hearts of Messina's townsfolk. Many rushed forward to help, hauling the weakened sailors ashore and guiding them to temporary shelters. Others stood back, sensing danger but unable to name it. No one knew that in their eagerness to assist, they were opening the gates to a horror far beyond human comprehension. The rats, once stowaways in the ship's cargo holds, scurried silently along the decks and into the warehouses. Fleas, invisible to the naked eye, leapt from creature to human, carrying the invisible plague in their tiny bodies. At first, it seemed as though it was only a small group affected. Families helped their neighbors, offering blankets and broth. Priests prayed over the sick, sprinkling holy water and chanting ancient verses meant to protect souls from evil. But the disease did not heed prayers. It spread silently, efficiently, inexorably. By the second week, more sailors had perished, their bodies stacked like refuse in hastily dug graves near the docks. The stench of decay mingled with the salt air, a grim harbinger of what was to come. The city's leaders debated what to do. Some called for quarantine, but no one fully understood how the sickness moved. Others insisted the dead be burned, fearing the contagion might linger in the earth. Panic began to rise. Stories spread of entire crews vanishing overnight, of black spots appearing on the skin of anyone who had touched the sailors, and of dreams filled with death and despair. Parents clutched children tightly, merchants abandoned their stalls, and the marketplace, once alive with chatter and negotiation, fell eerily silent. Amid the chaos, a few people observed patterns that others ignored. A fisherman noticed that those who avoided contact with the sailors remained healthy. A spice trader, whose goods had remained sealed in barrels, stayed alive while his neighbors succumbed. Small signs hinted at logic and reason behind the terror, but the lessons were buried beneath superstition and fear. No one yet understood the deadly partnership of flea and rat that had already begun to claim human life. As the sun set over Messina, casting long shadows across the harbor, the city held its breath. Each wave that lapped against the wooden docks carried both the beauty of the sea and the invisible threat that would soon sweep across the continent. The 12 Genoese ships, once symbols of commerce and connection, had become vessels of death, bringing with them the first true taste of Europe's darkest year. By the time the bells rang at dusk, tolling in warning and grief, the townsfolk realized with dawning horror their kindness, their eagerness to welcome strangers, had sealed their fate. Messina would not recover untouched. The cursed ships had arrived, and with them, the Black Death had begun its deadly march. It began with a sound that would haunt Messina forever, the tolling of church bells. At first, it was just one bell, pealing erratically from the cathedral tower, as though the heavy bronze clapper had a mind of its own. Villagers paused in the streets, baskets in hand, wondering if it was some forgotten festival or a priest's urgent summons. But the tolling did not stop. It spread from church to church, a cacophony of deep, mournful echoes that rolled through the narrow alleyways like the low rumble of an approaching storm. No one understood the meaning at first. Priests, exhausted from ministering to the sick, continued their prayers, hoping that divine intervention might hold back whatever had come with the Genoese ships. But the plague, as invisible as it was relentless, did not answer prayer. Within days, the first clergyman fell. Father Giovanni, who had blessed the sailors upon arrival, collapsed mid-sermon, clutching his chest as black spots spread across his pale skin. His voice, once commanding and steady, faded into a gurgle, leaving the congregation frozen in shock. The gravediggers were next. Messina relied on a handful of men to bury the dead, but even these laborers were not immune. Some vanished overnight, leaving shallow graves filled with bodies that would rot above ground. Others succumbed while digging, their shovels falling into the earth, as if fate itself had reached down to claim them. The town's streets, once lively with commerce and laughter, became pathways of dread, littered with the belongings of the dying and the cries of those who had lost family and friends. Panic took root. Mothers clutched infants to their chests, whispering prayers that seemed to vanish in the cold Mediterranean wind. Merchants abandoned their stalls, leaving wares rotting in the sun. Dogs and cats fled, their instincts sensing the invisible terror that stalked human beings. Rumors spread faster than the disease itself. The sickness was divine punishment, a curse from a distant land, or perhaps the work of witches who delighted in the suffering of the faithful. Each story, more terrifying than the last, fed the fear already gripping the hearts of the citizens. In the town square, those who remained gathered to discuss what could be done. Some suggested burning the sailors' bodies, hoping fire could purify both flesh and spirit. Others proposed quarantining the sick, keeping them isolated on ships or in remote warehouses. But each solution came with risk. Proximity to the ill often ensured infection, and even separation could not halt the plague's stealthy advance. The city's leaders were paralyzed by indecision, trapped between superstition, limited knowledge, and the growing panic of a populace desperate for survival. Night brought little relief. The bells tolled continuously, a grim soundtrack to the horrors unfolding. Windows were shuttered, and homes became prisons as families huddled together in fear. Shadows of the sick flickered in torchlight, moving like specters through the streets. It was in this darkness that the invisible nature of the plague became most terrifying. Death arrived silently, unseen, and unstoppable. Even those who prayed fervently or avoided contact with the sick could find themselves stricken. No one could outrun the hand of fate that the Black Death wielded. By the end of the first week, the full scope of the terror became undeniable. Streets that had once echoed with footsteps and chatter were now silent, save for the relentless tolling of the bells. Each peal reminded the citizens of Messina of their mortality, of lives claimed by an enemy they could not see. Families were broken, trade halted, and the city's lifeblood, its vibrant social and economic network, began to drain away. In the shadow of the cathedral, as the bells continued to toll, a chilling realization settled over Messina. The Black Death was not a visitor to be bargained with, nor a passing illness to be endured. It was an unstoppable force, moving with the precision of inevitability, leaving grief, fear, and devastation in its wake. And in the hearts of those who survived, the tolling of the first bells of death would echo forever, a sound that marked not only the loss of life, but the end of innocence and the beginning of Europe's darkest days. As the horrors in Messina unfolded, the Black Death did not pause to rest. It moved silently, carried on the wind, along trade routes and aboard ships and carts, leaving devastation in its invisible wake. Europe's bustling network of commerce, once the lifeblood of cities and towns, had become an unknowing highway for the plague. Merchants, anxious to protect their investments, packed their goods and fled northward, unknowingly transporting death along with silks, spices, and grains. Every wagon's wheel, every ship's plank, every leather crate became a vessel for catastrophe. The plague's march was insidious. Unlike an invading army, it left no visible banners, no drums of war. Yet it conquered with unparalleled efficiency. Towns that had once thrived on bustling markets and crowded streets now resembled ghost towns. Shops closed, stalls abandoned, and the laughter of children vanished. Travelers spoke of villages emptied overnight, doors swinging in the wind, and smoke rising from hastily burned homes. Fear rippled like a contagion itself, spreading faster than the disease it accompanied. In Genoa, merchants who had survived the initial outbreak at their docks faced an impossible choice. Some attempted to flee inland, hoping that mountains, forests, or rivers might act as barriers to the invisible killer. Others refused to leave, driven by greed, faith, or stubborn hope. But the plague moved regardless. Reports arrived from travelers and couriers. Each town along the route seemed to be caught in the same deadly rhythm. A few isolated villages remained untouched, mysterious anomalies that fueled rumors of divine protection, curses, or secret remedies. But they were the exceptions, not the rule. The cities of northern Italy, thriving centers of trade and art, felt the first icy grip of terror. Florence, Venice, and Milan found themselves besieged by a sickness they could neither see nor fight. Merchants arriving from Messina carried the disease in their goods, in the fleas hidden among their wares, and sometimes within their very bodies. Families were torn apart in days. Parents clutched children as they succumbed to fever and blackened swellings under their arms and on their legs. The sound of wailing replaced the music of the piazzas, and the smell of death began to seep through the narrow alleys, mixing with the aromas of freshly baked bread and the Mediterranean air. Travelers fleeing south to north often believed they could outrun fate. They abandoned villages in panic, leaving behind those who could not flee, inadvertently leaving the sick to care for one another or to die alone. Ships sailed from port to port, often leaving the harbor with empty holds only to return filled with plague-ridden corpses. Traders, desperate to protect their wealth, sometimes concealed their knowledge of sickness aboard their vessels, carrying contaminated cargo to distant ports. Each human decision, each act of panic or greed, accelerated the march of death across the continent. By the time the plague reached the Alpine passes and the valleys of the Holy Roman Empire, it had become a nightmare of logistics, invisible yet all-consuming. The once glorious trade networks that connected Europe had been transformed into conduits of despair. Inns, taverns, and marketplaces, places meant for human connection, now served as intersections of terror. People whispered of houses where entire families had perished, while neighbors remained untouched. Superstition and fear intertwined with survival, and the plague seemed almost intelligent, striking without pattern, yet leaving a trail of unmistakable ruin. Throughout the northern cities, a quiet desperation took hold. Priests prayed in vain, bell towers tolled continuously, and streets that once bustled with life were patrolled only by those brave or foolish enough to tend to the dead. The very fabric of daily life unraveled. Europe's economic and social heartbeat faltered under the weight of this silent, relentless march. What had started as whispers from the east had become an unstoppable tide, moving northward, leaving death, confusion, and fear in every city, village, and hamlet it touched. The Black Death was no longer a story of distant lands or faraway ports. It was a present, living horror, creeping silently into every corner of Europe. And as the first snow fell over the northern forests, blanketing fields that would never be harvested, the continent came to understand one terrifying truth. The plague did not knock politely. It did not discriminate. It marched north silently, patiently, and with deadly inevitability, rewriting Europe's future with every step. As the Black Death swept across Europe, it did not discriminate between the learned and the simple, the wealthy and the poor. Those trained in medicine, whose knowledge had once promised protection and healing, found themselves powerless against an enemy invisible to the eye, yet merciless in its speed. The streets, already quiet with fear, filled with the desperate cries of the sick and dying, echoing through alleys where no help would come. And in these shadowed corridors of human suffering, the doctors of the time were forced to confront a grim reality. Their skills, honed over decades, were failing. Physicians donned their robes and took up their instruments with a grim determination, hoping that ritual and method could stand against the relentless plague. Bloodletting became the first line of defense. Patients were tied to chairs or beds, as doctors made shallow cuts in their arms or legs, letting crimson life pour into basins. They believed that by releasing bad humors, the disease would be expelled along with the blood. But the sick often grew weaker, collapsing under the procedure. Some died during treatment. Others lingered, their bodies succumbing to fever, swollen lymph nodes, and blackened skin as the disease advanced with inexorable certainty. Leeches and poultices followed, applied with care, yet with little understanding of the microscopic world that truly governed infection. Physicians ground herbs and mixed powders of mercury, vinegar, and rare spices into pungent pastes. Some applied them to boils, others insisted patients ingest them in the hope of purging their system. The smells were sharp, acrid, and often unbearable, but the methods reflected the era's desperate grasp for control. Faith and medicine, once parallel paths toward healing, became intertwined with superstition and ritual, as fear drove both patient and healer to extremes. Hospitals, where they existed, filled beyond capacity. The sick lay shoulder to shoulder on wooden boards and straw mats, their moans blending into a chorus of suffering. The air was thick with heat, with incense, and with the acrid stench of decay. Some physicians tried isolation within the hospital walls, but the knowledge of contagion was still embryonic, and the disease spread even within the wards. Even the most careful doctor risked exposure, their hands, garments, and instruments becoming unwitting vehicles for death. Many succumbed themselves, their names lost to the very plague they had sought to combat. Amid the chaos, some doctors began to notice strange patterns. Those living in cleaner houses or away from crowded streets seemed to fare better. Children occasionally survived when adults did not. Markets, bustling with trade, were hotspots of infection, while remote villages sometimes remained untouched. Yet these observations, fragmented and inconsistent, could not form the coherent understanding needed to combat the plague. Medicine, based largely on classical texts and tradition, had no answer for an enemy that operated beyond their knowledge. Public trust in physicians eroded as death followed every attempt at healing. Families stopped calling for help, retreating into homes and cottages with their sick relatives. Some communities turned to self-styled healers, alchemists, or wandering mystics, whose remedies were no less fanciful, but often more dramatic. Candlelit rooms echoed with the chanting of incantations as much as the scraping of lancets, blending the sacred and the scientific in a world teetering on the brink of despair. Yet, within this darkness of repeated failure, glimmers of human ingenuity appeared. A few meticulous physicians recorded the effects of distance and isolation. They noted that outbreaks seemed more severe in crowded streets than in small homes. These scattered observations, though not fully understood at the time, laid the groundwork for methods that would centuries later evolve into quarantine and epidemiology. The doctors of desperation, while often helpless in the face of the Black Death, were not entirely defeated. Their courage and their mistakes taught lessons about the limits of knowledge, the fragility of human life, and the delicate balance between science, superstition, and hope. As Europe's towns emptied and streets fell silent, these physicians became witnesses to a catastrophe that reshaped the very understanding of mortality, leaving a legacy that would echo in the medical world for centuries. Europe had no cure, no defense against the Black Death, but in the desperate actions, failed remedies, and painstaking observations of these doctors, the seeds of understanding began to take root, quietly, painfully, and without recognition. As the Black Death swept mercilessly through Europe, fear became as pervasive as the disease itself. When medicine faltered and death arrived with terrifying swiftness, many turned to religion for protection, guidance, and comfort. Monks, priests, and holy men became beacons of hope in a world rapidly succumbing to despair, though their faith often collided with the brutal reality of the plague. In towns and villages, people sought divine intervention, desperate to escape a fate they could neither see nor understand. Churches overflowed. Streets were lined with the faithful, clutching rosaries, candles, or relics said to possess miraculous powers. Priests paraded sacred objects, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, and icons painted with gold and holy paint, believing their mere presence could shield townsfolk from the invisible killer. Pilgrims crawled on knees for miles to shrines, braving snow, mud, and exhaustion, convinced that humility and devotion might spare their lives. The air was thick with incense, chanting and prayers, as if the volume of devotion itself might suffocate the plague. Yet faith, no matter how fervent, was powerless against this microscopic terror. Bells tolled incessantly, graveyards overflowed, and the once proud clergy found themselves collapsing beside their parishioners. Even monasteries, often isolated and insulated from urban centers, could not escape the relentless reach of the Black Death. In some cases, entire monastic communities perished, their libraries and sacred manuscripts left untouched on empty benches. The spiritual fortresses of Europe, long seen as unassailable bastions of wisdom and divine protection, crumbled under the weight of disease and despair. Whispers of doubt and fear began to circulate. Some townsfolk accused priests of failing in their sacred duties. Others wondered if the plague was divine punishment. Perhaps God had abandoned them, angered by sin, greed, or heresy. Superstition deepened as people looked for explanations in shadows. The alignment of the stars, the movement of planets, or the presence of witches who must be punished to restore divine favor. Pilgrimages continued, but their success was inconsistent. Some who traveled great distances remained healthy, while neighbors who stayed home fell ill. This unpredictability sowed confusion, panic, and in some cases, anger directed at the very holy men they had once revered. Holy men themselves were not immune to fear. Many prayed not only for their parishioners, but also for their own survival, performing rituals and blessings that grew increasingly desperate. Processions through town squares became common, with priests sprinkling holy water over streets and rooftops, hoping to purify the air. Some communities organized penitential marches, in which townspeople would scourge themselves publicly, believing that suffering could appease divine wrath. Yet these acts rarely correlated with survival, leaving a growing sense of futility that gnawed at both clergy and laity alike. The plague's devastation revealed a chilling duality. Faith inspired resilience, yet it could also foster delusion. As people sought miracles, others turned to violence and blame, convinced that sinners, outsiders, or heretics were the cause of divine displeasure. The holy men, once the unquestioned moral and spiritual authority, were often powerless to quell hysteria. Their rituals, while comforting to some, could not stem the tide of death that flowed relentlessly through cities, villages, and hamlets alike. Still, within this desperation, the devotion of the faithful had lasting echoes. Communities that embraced ritual and collective prayer often demonstrated resilience, if only psychologically. The act of coming together, singing hymns, tending to the dying, supporting one another through prayer, offered a fragile thread of humanity amid the chaos. The Black Death exposed not only mortality, but also the limits of spiritual authority, teaching a grim lesson. Faith alone could not protect against the realities of the natural world, however fervent the devotion or grand the relics. By the end of this chapter in Europe's nightmare, It was clear that holy men could guide the living, but they could not save them from death itself. The Black Death's reach was impartial, indifferent to piety or ritual. It exposed human vulnerability and humility, highlighting the fragile boundary between hope and futility. Yet, even in the face of failure, the devotion of the faithful left an indelible mark on history, a testament to humanity's enduring desire to find meaning and comfort in the midst of unimaginable loss. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, fear took on a physical form, a symbol of human desperation that would endure in the collective imagination for centuries. The beaked mask of the plague doctor. Unlike the priests who prayed for divine intervention, these physicians sought a different kind of protection, one rooted in observation, superstition, and the limited science of their time. The mask, with its long curved beak filled with aromatic herbs and spices, became both a shield and a warning, an emblem of death walking among the living. The plague doctors emerged first in Italy, responding to the chaos that consumed cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan. Their robes, dyed a somber black, were designed to protect every inch of skin from the invisible menace. Gloves, boots, and long cloaks sealed them away from direct contact, while the mask's hollow beak extended several inches from the face, stuffed with lavender, rose petals, cinnamon, and cloves. The belief was simple. Foul air carried disease, while sweet smells purified the air inhaled by the wearer. In the streets, the sight of a doctor in full costume was terrifying, yet oddly reassuring, an acknowledgement that someone somewhere was attempting to fight the invisible enemy. Inside the beaked masks, physicians confronted a paradox of terror and courage. They walked through streets littered with the dead and dying, often alone, examining bodies with long wooden staffs rather than touch. Their eyes, shielded behind glass eyepieces, watched silently as families crumpled in despair and neighbors fled from their homes. The beak became a metaphor for distance, a physical reminder that the plague could not be confronted with closeness, that survival demanded caution, even detachment. Yet these doctors were not immune to panic. Their tools were primitive, their understanding of disease almost non-existent, and the methods they relied upon, herbs, fumigation, and protective clothing, offered only partial protection. Many succumbed to fever and buboes despite their precautions. Still, they moved among the sick, documenting symptoms, counting bodies, and keeping notes that would later inform generations of medical knowledge. In their failures, they inadvertently became chroniclers of an invisible war, bridging superstition and the embryonic seeds of science. The masks also symbolized the psychological terror that swept through cities. Seeing a black-robed figure with a bird-like face approaching your home was enough to strike fear into even the bravest heart. Children hid under tables, dogs howled, and the sick sometimes begged for mercy, as if the doctor's presence alone was a harbinger of death. Townsfolk whispered of witches, demons, and dark spirits, connecting the macabre appearance of the doctors to the unrelenting plague. In every encounter, the mask served as a chilling reminder that death was present, tangible, and patient. Despite the fear, some physicians achieved remarkable insights. They began to notice patterns, the proximity of the sick to the healthy, the spread along trade routes, and the clustering of cases in densely populated areas. Though their understanding was limited and often entangled with superstition, these observations hinted at the principles of contagion and isolation. The beaked mask, though a bizarre artifact of fear, was part of a larger experiment in protection, an attempt to navigate a world where the enemy was invisible yet devastatingly real. The imagery of plague doctors, preserved in drawings and etchings long after the Black Death passed, reflects a unique intersection of horror, ingenuity, and desperation. They were human beings confronting an enemy beyond comprehension, using whatever knowledge, superstition, and courage they could muster. The beak, the robe, and the staff were both practical tools and psychological armor, protecting bodies and minds in a landscape dominated by death. As the Black Death continued its grim march northward, the plague doctors became fixtures of the European nightmare. They were symbols of resilience and fear, science and superstition, hope and inevitability. Their presence did not stop the deaths, nor did it save the sick, but it provided a strange comfort to the living, a visible acknowledgement that someone somewhere was willing to face the darkness head-on, masked and armed with herbs, knowledge, and the faintest glimmer of hope. As the Black Death consumed town after town, a chilling contrast emerged between the streets of the dying and the secluded halls of the privileged. Nobles, confident in their wealth and the supposed sanctity of their estates, refused to believe that disease could touch them. They retreated behind thick stone walls, lavish gates, and carefully locked doors, hosting grand feasts to defy the invisible terror lurking beyond their courtyards. What they did not realize was that these very gatherings, meant to celebrate life and display power, would often seal their doom. Inside candlelit halls, long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fruits, and exotic delicacies imported from distant lands. Goblets overflowed with wine, and choirs hummed solemn melodies, masking the silence of the world outside. The lords and ladies laughed, clinking glasses in a defiant toast to fortune, youth, and vitality. Servants moved quietly among them, attending to every whim, bringing more wine, replenishing plates, and offering perfumed cloths to cleanse the air. It was a scene of opulence, a temporary reprieve from the horrors consuming the streets, but it was also a perilous illusion, for the plague did not respect wealth, walls, or privilege. The very servants who carried the abundance of life carried also the invisible death. The paradox of the banquet lay in its intimacy. These gatherings, designed to showcase status and protection, created the perfect environment for the disease to spread. The same hands that polished silver and poured wine touched the robes and skin of the hosts. Air, shared in close quarters, carried the same fleas and germs that had decimated common towns. Even the carefully prepared food offered no protection. Contamination could hide in grains, meats, and vessels. What nobles thought of as safety, isolation within their marble halls, became a trap, turning the banquet into a chamber of doom. Yet even as the plague infiltrated these estates, the wealthy clung to rituals of reassurance. Physicians in dark robes attended, sometimes with the infamous beaked masks, offering potions of mercury, herbal remedies, and prayers for protection. Alchemists whispered of secret formulas that could repel death, while astrologers charted the alignment of stars to divine fortune. Candles, incense, and the sweet scent of flowers were spread across the room in an attempt to purify the air. Some nobles bathed in rosewater or rubbed exotic oils over their skin, believing that luxury, scent, and ceremony could shield them from the inevitable. But none of these measures could halt the march of the Black Death. Even the most elaborate precautions failed when the disease, like a patient predator, found a way in. Stories of these feasts spread as warnings for the ages. Guests who had laughed 1 hour were found dead in their chambers the next, swollen with fever, covered in blackened boils, their bodies abandoned in haste. Entire households perished within days, leaving the opulent halls empty and silent. In some cases, only a single family member survived, left to bury their relatives amid a haunting silence. The contrast between the life of the banquet and the death that followed became a stark reminder. Wealth could not outwit nature, nor could human hubris escape the impartiality of disease. And yet, these gatherings were not entirely devoid of meaning. They revealed the psychology of fear and denial, the lengths to which humans will go to assert control over fate, and the desperation to maintain normalcy in the face of the unimaginable. In their opulence and folly, the nobles mirrored the common folk in their struggle against death, both powerless, both grasping at hope in different ways, both witnesses to a world unmoored by terror. By the time the final plate was cleared and the last wine goblet emptied, The Black Death had claimed yet another stronghold. The banquet, meant to assert life over death, had instead become a testament to the fragility of human power, the futility of pride, and the inevitability of nature's reach. In the echoes of empty halls and the ashes of extinguished candles, history would remember the opulent folly, a stark reminder that no fortress, however grand, could outlast the silent, relentless march of the plague. As the Black Death swept relentlessly through Europe, desperation grew into radical, often gruesome measures. When medicine failed and prayers went unanswered, communities turned to fire and ritual as a last defense against the invisible enemy. Homes, clothing, and possessions of the infected were burned in furious purges, while the living sought protection through scents, luxury, and elaborate customs, hoping, in vain, that human ingenuity could outwit the merciless plague. In the narrow streets of Florence, smoke curled into the sky as homes suspected of harboring the sick were set ablaze. The smell of charred timber, burning fabrics, and melted wax filled the air. Families watched as their neighbors' dwellings were consumed, unsure whether this was salvation or punishment. Some towns adopted citywide burnings, believing that fire could cleanse not only objects, but also the very air itself. In Paris, entire warehouses storing contaminated goods were sacrificed to the flames, a costly yet urgent attempt to purify both commerce and community. Fire became both a weapon and a symbol, a desperate attempt to assert control over a world turned upside down by death. Yet fire alone could not guarantee safety. In many cases, it caused more harm than good. Flames spread uncontrollably, consuming homes and livelihoods alongside disease. Panic escalated as entire streets burned, and the social fabric of cities began to unravel. Merchants lost goods essential for survival, families were displaced, and the sick were often left to die unassisted in the rubble. The flames that were meant to protect became a reminder that the fight against the plague was not only against bacteria and fleas, but also against human fear and chaos. Parallel to the fire-driven rituals, communities embraced more delicate, fragrant strategies. Rosewater, herbs, and perfumes became talismans against death, filling homes with sweet, cloying scents intended to ward off the invisible miasma believed to carry the plague. People bathed in rosewater or sprinkled petals across floors, hoping that beauty, fragrance, and ritual could act as armor. Jewelry, gemstones, and fine silks were worn as protective charms, their perceived value thought to repel disease. In England, some even adorned their doors with garlands of herbs, believing that scent alone could mark the boundary between life and death. These customs, though futile in stopping the plague, provided a measure of psychological comfort, a belief that human action could influence fate, however small the effect. In rural villages, other rituals emerged, blending superstition and observation. Some communities avoided public spaces entirely, retreating into isolated cottages and surrounding themselves with smoke and herbs. Others carried out symbolic ceremonies, drawing protective circles on doors, chanting incantations, and leaving offerings to ward off spirits thought to carry disease. These practices reveal the interplay between fear and logic, where imagination became a tool of survival and ritual a framework for understanding the incomprehensible. The juxtaposition of fire and fragrance, destruction and delicacy, underscores the duality of human response to catastrophe. People sought to purify, protect, and survive, oscillating between violent action and gentle ritual. Fire demanded action and sacrifice, leaving visible consequences in its wake. Roses and incense offered subtle comfort, a quiet hope that sensory experience could influence fate. Together, they paint a picture of a society grappling with helplessness, balancing terror and hope, logic and superstition, destruction and beauty. Amidst the smoke and petals, the plague continued its indifferent march. Fire and roses, though symbolically potent, could not halt death's advance. Still, These desperate measures left an enduring impression on history. They illustrate the lengths humans will go to assert agency in the face of the uncontrollable, the ways in which fear can shape culture, and the fragile threads of hope that persist even when the world seems consumed by darkness. By the end of this chapter, it becomes evident. Survival was never guaranteed, and every action carried risk. Fire could cleanse, but it could also destroy. Roses could comfort, but they could not heal. In the dance of smoke and petals, Europe learned a bitter truth. That disease was as much a psychological battlefield as it was a biological one, and that the fight for life demanded both courage and humility in the face of an invisible enemy. Amidst the relentless devastation of the Black Death, whispers began to circulate across Europe of a place untouched by the scourge, a village where the bells of death never tolled, where the streets remained strangely quiet, and where life seemed to persist as though the plague itself had forgotten it. Travelers spoke of it in hushed tones, scholars scribbled notes in the margins of manuscripts, and neighbors gazed in disbelief. This was the village that didn't die, an enigma in a world consumed by mortality. Nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, the village seemed cut off from the usual trade routes and communication lines that had spread the plague with such terrifying efficiency. Its isolation was more than geographic. It was a living, breathing barrier. Outsiders remarked on the clarity of the air, the sparkling purity of the streams, and the meticulous cleanliness maintained by the villagers. Streets were swept, homes aired, and animals kept at a distance, practices that, unknown to them, would serve as early forms of quarantine. The villagers themselves were initially unaware of the unique status of their home. They continued their daily routines, tending crops, baking bread, and performing rituals that had long been passed down through generations. Their lives felt ordinary, even as the world beyond their valley descended into chaos. Then came travelers, some fleeing death in nearby towns, others seeking fortune in uncertain times. These newcomers arrived with tales of plague-ridden cities, of bells tolling for the dead, of entire families vanishing overnight. Panic crept into the village, and the villagers listened with a mix of fear, disbelief, and curiosity. Yet remarkably, none of the travelers brought death with them, at least not immediately. The villagers noted the absence of fever, of buboes, of the telltale black spots that had become synonymous with doom. Some attribute it to divine favor, claiming that their village was blessed by the saints. Others whispered of curses, suggesting that the plague had deliberately passed them by to punish neighboring communities. In truth, the reasons for their survival were a combination of geography, isolation, and inadvertently hygienic practices, factors that centuries later would form the foundation of epidemiology. The phenomenon of the village sparked both awe and suspicion. Scholars and priests debated its meaning. Was it luck, divine intervention, or the result of some secret knowledge hidden by the villagers? Missionaries visited, hoping to uncover miracles, while merchants speculated whether the village held treasures unknown to the world. Outsiders pressed for entry, fearing contamination, but also yearning for insight. In every interaction, the village became a living laboratory, a quiet testament to survival amid universal death. The villagers themselves became conscious of their unique position. They implemented subtle measures to preserve it, quarantining any newcomers, burning potentially contaminated goods, and relying on the natural boundaries of their valley. Their rituals, once ordinary, now took on heightened significance. Daily walks to the well, weekly cleaning of homes, and careful preparation of food were no longer mundane chores. They were acts of preservation, invisible defenses against an enemy no one fully understood. Legends began to grow around the village. Children were told stories of ancestors whose wisdom, care, and respect for nature had shielded them from death. Travelers left with tales of a miraculous place where the sun always seemed to shine and where laughter rang louder than the toll of church bells in plague-ridden towns. These stories, exaggerated and romanticized, ensured that the village's survival became part of Europe's cultural memory, a symbol of hope and resilience in an age defined by fear. Yet even in this haven, uncertainty lingered. The villagers knew that their safety was fragile, dependent on circumstances they could not control. One misstep, a visitor carrying the unseen pathogen, a lapse in hygiene, or a breach of the natural boundaries, could transform their sanctuary into another graveyard. This awareness, a quiet tension beneath daily life, underscored the delicate balance between survival and catastrophe, highlighting the profound truths the Black Death was teaching Europe. Life persisted not only through luck, but through vigilance, care, and respect for forces both seen and unseen. In the annals of history, the village that didn't die stands as a beacon of survival. Its story reminds us that amid catastrophe, pockets of resistance exist, shaped by human ingenuity, environment, and sometimes sheer fortune. In the shadow of death, it offered proof that survival was possible, that even in the darkest times, life could endure. While isolated villages survived through a combination of geography, vigilance, and inadvertent hygiene, some cities took deliberate action to resist the relentless spread of the Black Death. Among them, a coastal city in northern Italy became the stage for what historians would later call the first true quarantine experiment, a bold, terrifying, and ultimately pioneering attempt to wrest control from an invisible enemy that had claimed so much of Europe. In the bustling port city, the docks were normally filled with merchants, sailors, and goods arriving from across the Mediterranean. Salted fish, silks, spices, and timber created a symphony of commerce that had sustained the city for generations. But as reports of plague-ravaged towns arrived via letters and travelers, fear took hold. Ships from Sicily, already marked by death, were still unloading their cargo. Some sailors had fallen ill mid-voyage, while others carried the disease silently, oblivious to the destruction trailing behind them. City leaders realized that ordinary measures, prayer, fire, and herbs had failed elsewhere. Something drastic had to be done. The city council convened in secret, their deliberations heavy with fear and moral ambiguity. They resolved to isolate all incoming ships for 40 days, a period known as 40 giorni, derived from the Italian word for 40. The term would eventually evolve into the modern word quarantine. The decision was met with outrage and disbelief. Merchants protested, fearing financial ruin. Sailors grumbled, trapped in the sweltering hold of their ships. And citizens debated whether such harsh measures were humane or tyrannical. Yet the city leaders were resolute. They understood that action, no matter how severe, was preferable to surrendering to an unstoppable plague. Ships were cordoned off in harbor bays, anchored at a distance from the city walls. Guards patrolled the perimeter, ensuring no unauthorized contact occurred. Sailors were provided food and water, but their freedom was strictly limited. The city created temporary shelters, isolating the infected and observing the healthy. Families arriving from abroad were often separated, a cruel necessity that caused anguish but also prevented the spread of infection. The city became a living laboratory, with fear and science intertwined in an uneasy alliance. During the quarantine, observations emerged that would astonish future generations. Healthy individuals remained free from infection if they avoided direct contact with the sick. Merchants discovered that contaminated goods left untouched for days did not transmit disease as readily as once feared. Some physicians, while still relying on flawed medical theories, began to recognize patterns. Distance mattered, isolation worked, and time could protect the vulnerable. In an era dominated by superstition, these insights were revolutionary, even if their implications were not fully understood. The results of the 40 giorni experiment were immediate and profound. Ships that completed the 40-day isolation were allowed to dock, and remarkably, the city experienced fewer deaths than neighboring ports that had not implemented similar measures. Traders cautiously resumed business, and the city's economy, though strained, survived. Word of the experiment spread throughout Europe, inspiring other ports and coastal cities to adopt similar practices. Though crude by modern standards, the quarantine represented one of humanity's earliest attempts to control a deadly pathogen through collective action, observation, and disciplined enforcement. Yet the experiment was not without human cost. Sailors endured hunger, isolation, and fear. Families were torn apart. Tempers flared, and occasionally guards resorted to violence to maintain compliance. Ethical dilemmas abounded. Should a sick individual be allowed to mingle with the healthy if it risked their life? Could a city justify such extreme measures? These moral questions, born of desperation and necessity, echo through history, foreshadowing the dilemmas faced by societies confronting epidemics even centuries later. The quarantine experiment revealed a profound truth. Survival required foresight, cooperation, and courage. While the Black Death spared no one in its wake, careful observation and disciplined action could reduce the toll. In this city, human ingenuity, guided by fear and necessity, had created a protective barrier against an otherwise unstoppable force. It became a model, a historical turning point where reason began to challenge superstition, and where the seeds of public health were first planted. In the quiet aftermath, as ships finally docked and streets slowly returned to life, the city's leaders reflected on their gamble. They had risked rebellion, anger, and social unrest to protect their people. Against the grim backdrop of Europe's devastation, the quarantine journey had proven that even in the face of relentless death, humanity could exert influence, if only for a moment, over the course of fate itself. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, fear began to warp human reason. Death stalked towns and cities relentlessly, and when the invisible killer could not be fought by medicine, isolation, or fire, people turned to a more destructive response: blame. Across the continent, panic morphed into suspicion, and suspicion soon erupted into violence. The plague, which claimed lives indiscriminately, now also sowed seeds of hatred, suspicion, and cruelty, as communities searched desperately for someone, anyone, to hold accountable for their suffering. In crowded medieval cities, where mortality rates climbed into the tens of thousands, neighbors began to eye one another with growing distrust. Foreigners, traveling merchants, and itinerant laborers were the first to be accused. They brought goods from distant lands, just as ships had brought the plague, and in a climate of fear, these outsiders became convenient scapegoats. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers that merchants had poisoned wells, that strangers carried deadly curses, that foreigners danced with the devil to bring misfortune. These suspicions ignited anger, fear, and mob mentality, turning communities against themselves. Jews, already marginalized in many European towns, became frequent targets. Accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease, Jewish communities faced brutal massacres, forced conversions, and expulsions. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, synagogues burned, and centuries of history shattered in a wave of misguided vengeance. Historians estimate that in some regions, these attacks claimed more lives than the disease itself, leaving a trail of human cruelty intertwined with the plague's natural horrors. Families fled in terror, only to find that safety was fleeting and that fear often followed them farther than the pathogen did. Lepers, beggars, and the socially outcast were also blamed, their existence suddenly interpreted as threatening. Hospitals and almshouses, once sanctuaries for the poor and sick, were sometimes abandoned or destroyed, leaving the vulnerable to die. The human instinct to find meaning in chaos led people to conclude that misfortune must have a visible perpetrator, that death, even in its most random form, was the result of deliberate malevolence. And so, vengeance became a form of control, a desperate way for terrified communities to assert power over a world that seemed utterly beyond their control. Religious fervor compounded the social unrest. Preachers and priests, interpreting the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins, encouraged extreme acts of penance and purification. Flagellant movements emerged, groups of men and women who walked from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for the sins of all. While intended as a spiritual safeguard, these public displays often provoked panic rather than comfort, as spectators feared that such acts might anger God further or attract death directly to them. The line between devotion and hysteria blurred, and communities oscillated between prayer, punishment, and violence. Even in more rural villages, the blame game emerged in subtle forms. Neighbors accused one another of hoarding food, withholding remedies, or failing to adhere to precautionary measures. Entire families were ostracized for harboring the sick, and whispers of witchcraft or curses spread quickly. Children were taught to fear certain families, and traditions once meant to unite communities fractured under the weight of suspicion. Fear, amplified by grief and loss, became a powerful weapon, splitting households and towns into factions of distrust. Yet amid the horror, the consequences of blame were instructive. Scholars, chroniclers, and cautious leaders observed that scapegoating did nothing to halt the disease. If anything, it exacerbated it. Communities weakened by violence and mistrust became more vulnerable to infection. Supply lines faltered when traders were shunned or attacked. Families displaced by mob violence struggled to survive, and in their movement, sometimes carried the plague further, inadvertently amplifying the very threat they sought to explain. The lesson of this chapter is stark. Panic can be as deadly as any pathogen. The Black Death revealed not only the fragility of the human body, but also the fragility of human morality and reason under stress. It exposed how quickly societies could descend into cruelty when fear overpowered empathy, how irrationality can flourish in the absence of understanding, and how collective survival depends as much on cooperation and rational action as it does on luck or immunity. As towns slowly regained order, the memory of these blame-driven atrocities lingered, etched into European consciousness alongside the stories of the dead. The plague had not only reshaped populations, but had also rewritten social norms, leaving a stark warning. In times of crisis, humanity's greatest threat may not only be the disease itself, but the fear it ignites within our hearts. Amid the chaos of fear, flight, and superstition that swept across plague-ravaged Europe, another, quieter menace thrived: the human impulse for greed. In a bustling port city along the Mediterranean, a merchant named Giovanni Lazzari became an unwitting or perhaps deliberate instrument of the Black Death's spread. His story would reveal one of the most unsettling truths of the plague: that human avarice, ambition, and deception could amplify the disease's reach, claiming countless lives in the shadow of its silent march. Giovanni had spent years building his trade network, connecting Italian ports with distant lands across the Black Sea and beyond. His ships carried spices, silks, grains, and treasures from east to west, a lifeline of commerce that fueled the wealth of his city. But in the autumn of 1347, a fateful cargo arrived from the eastern Mediterranean, sacks of grain infested with fleas, rats stowing away in the hold, and traces of disease hidden beneath the aroma of spices. Giovanni, either unaware of the danger or willfully ignoring it, prepared to unload his wares and sell them for the highest price. The port was crowded with sailors, laborers, and merchants. The city relied on commerce for survival, even as rumors of plague in nearby towns spread like wildfire. Giovanni's dockworkers noticed the unusual behavior of rats crawling from his ships, the sickly appearance of some sailors, and the ominous stench emanating from the holds. Superstitious murmurs circulated among them, warnings that death had come with the cargo. But Giovanni, focused on profit, dismissed their concerns, promising timely payment for the goods and urging them to work quickly. As the sacks were transported into warehouses and the goods distributed to markets, the consequences became immediate. Families who purchased the grain or used it for baking soon fell ill. Rats scuttling through homes and streets carried fleas laden with the deadly Yersinia pestis bacteria. Within days, fever and swelling appeared among the townsfolk. Giovanni's warehouses became unintentional epicenters of contagion, and the very wealth he sought to secure became a weapon of death. The city descended into panic. Neighbors whispered about cursed merchants and poisoned goods. Rumors of Giovanni's complicity, intentional or otherwise, spread faster than the plague itself. Some claimed he had received the grain as a gift from distant lands and knowingly risked the city's lives for profit. Others suggested that ignorance was the culprit, but the effect was the same. Suspicion, fear, and death surged in tandem. The once vibrant market square became a scene of quiet terror as families fled, shops closed, and the bells tolled for the sick. Yet Giovanni's actions inadvertently revealed something crucial to the understanding of the plague. Observers noted the correlation between trade goods, merchants' routes, and the spread of infection, while the underlying cause, fleas on rats carrying Yersinia pestis, would not be scientifically understood for centuries. These empirical patterns offered early insight. The movement of people and commodities was intrinsically linked to the disease's propagation. In his greed, Giovanni had illuminated a hidden truth about contagion, one that would eventually inform practices of quarantine and trade restrictions. The human cost of his actions was devastating. Entire neighborhoods emptied as infection ravaged homes. Families vanished overnight. Priests, physicians, and gravediggers worked feverishly, their efforts often failing. Giovanni himself, despite wealth and status, could not escape the disease indefinitely. His legacy became a haunting reminder that no measure of riches or cunning could protect against the indiscriminate reach of death. Over time, Giovanni's story became emblematic of a broader lesson. The Black Death did not discriminate based on status or morality, yet human actions could worsen its impact. Greed, deception, and negligence were as lethal as fleas or rats. The plague's terror was amplified by human choices, underscoring a stark truth about survival. In times of crisis, ethical responsibility is inseparable from the fate of communities. Individual selfishness, even in pursuit of livelihood, could tip the scales from survival to catastrophe. In the annals of history, Giovanni's secret cargo stands as a cautionary tale. The merchant, driven by ambition, became an unwitting catalyst for death. His story reminds us that epidemics are not only biological phenomena, but human dramata, shaped by choices, behavior, and moral reckoning. Even amidst the inevitability of disease, it was human action, for better or worse, that determined the breadth of its devastation. As the Black Death swept mercilessly through Europe, claiming the lives of millions, a peculiar and almost miraculous phenomenon began to capture the attention of those who survived, the children who lived. In towns and villages shattered by death, where entire families had vanished overnight, some young ones inexplicably remained untouched. These children, often frail from lack of food, but resilient against the disease, sparked both awe and superstition, becoming symbols of hope in a world otherwise defined by despair. The phenomenon was first noticed in small, isolated villages. In one Italian town, for example, of a population of over 500, nearly every adult had succumbed to fever and swelling, yet a handful of children wandered the streets, unharmed. Some clung to the bodies of their parents, while others were discovered hiding in attics or beneath collapsed houses. Villagers who had survived alongside them began to whisper that these children were chosen by God, spared for reasons beyond mortal understanding. Religious leaders interpreted their survival as divine intervention, often gathering the children in churches for prayers of thanks and protection. But the reasons for their survival were not solely spiritual. Observers began to notice patterns. Many of these children lived in homes with better ventilation, cleaner water, or relative isolation from infected adults. Some were naturally robust, their immune systems inadvertently stronger against the bacterium. While the people of the time could not articulate the scientific mechanisms at play, their observations were accurate enough to provide hints of early epidemiology. Proximity, sanitation, and even dietary factors could influence outcomes, even if the concepts of germs or bacteria were unknown. Stories of the children who lived spread across regions, sometimes taking on legendary qualities. In France, a group of orphans wandered between villages, singing lullabies learned from their deceased mothers. People who heard the songs felt a strange sense of calm, as if the melody itself carried protective power. In Germany, a boy who survived 3 households' outbreaks became a symbol of resilience, regarded as a bringer of luck and fertility. These narratives served multiple purposes. They offered hope to grieving communities, reinforced moral and religious lessons, and even shaped local folklore for generations to come. The survival of children also had practical consequences. Villages with immune or resilient youth were more likely to recover in the aftermath of the plague. These children inherited skills, traditions, and knowledge from the adults who had died, becoming crucial to the rebuilding of societies. Artisans, farmers, and future leaders often traced their lineage or training through these rare survivors, linking survival to the continuity of culture itself. In this way, the children who lived were not just anomalies of biology. They were the seeds of a Europe that would rise from devastation. Yet their existence also provoked fear and suspicion. Some adults, desperate to explain the randomness of survival, whispered that these children were touched by witchcraft, or that their very immunity was a curse on those around them. In some extreme cases, jealousy or superstition led to persecution, as communities struggled to reconcile the presence of the unharmed among the dying. The delicate balance between reverence and fear mirrored humanity's broader response to the plague, a mix of hope, misunderstanding, and moral confusion. Amid these contradictions, one truth remained clear: the survival of children illuminated the fragility and resilience of life. Where death had seemed absolute, these young ones offered proof that nature's hand was not entirely predictable. They became living reminders that even in the face of overwhelming catastrophe, there existed pockets of resistance, moments of chance, and sparks of continuity. In observing them, medieval societies learned, perhaps unconsciously, that disease was not always indiscriminate, that patterns existed, and that survival often depended on factors beyond mere proximity to death. By the end of the plague's first waves, the children who lived had grown into a new generation, carrying the memory of the Black Death not as a distant tragedy, but as a personal inheritance of survival, resilience, and mystery. They became the living witnesses of a dark chapter in human history, a reminder that even when half of Europe perished, life could endure, adapt, and continue its intricate, unpredictable dance. Amid the horror and chaos of the Black Death, when towns lay half-empty and families vanished overnight, a quiet figure moved through the streets, a monk named Brother Anselm, whose curiosity and observation would lay the first faint stones of what would one day become modern medicine. Unlike physicians in elaborate robes or merchants focused on profit, Anselm had no ambitions for wealth or fame. His mission was simple yet profound: to understand the plague in order to protect those he could, and perhaps to preserve life where faith and fear failed. Anselm's monastery was perched on the outskirts of a small yet strategic town in northern Italy. While much of the city had succumbed to fever, swelling, and despair, the monks observed patterns that many overlooked. Brother Anselm noticed that some households were entirely wiped out, while others, seemingly just as exposed, remained untouched. At first, he attributed it to divine mercy, but over time, patterns emerged that could not be explained by prayer alone. He began keeping meticulous notes. He recorded the conditions of homes, the number of visitors, the cleanliness of water supplies, and the frequency of contact with outsiders. He noted that children who played outside more often survived, while those confined in crowded rooms with the sick were more likely to fall ill. Wells that were regularly cleaned produced healthier water, while stagnant supplies led to clusters of sickness. Even simple practices, such as boiling water for tea or using herbs to flavor meals, seemed to confer subtle benefits. Anselm did not yet understand bacteria, fleas, or contagion, but he could see the effects of isolation, sanitation, and avoidance of the obviously sick. Word of his observations spread cautiously. Fellow monks and townspeople began consulting him, seeking guidance. Keep your distance from the ill, he would advise. Change water daily. Wash hands and utensils, however rudimentary it may be. Though primitive by modern standards, these instructions saved lives. Families who followed them saw lower mortality, and the monastery itself became a small sanctuary amid death's relentless sweep. Anselm's work, though not widely recognized at the time, hinted at a truth centuries ahead of its formal discovery. Disease followed patterns, and human behavior could influence its spread. Yet his life was not without fear. He watched friends, novices, and parishioners die despite his best efforts. Some accused him of heresy for observing rather than praying. Others whispered that his instructions were pointless, or worse, arrogant attempts to rival God. Still, he persisted, driven by a combination of compassion and a nascent scientific instinct. He experimented cautiously, separating the sick from the healthy, providing cleaner water, and noting which combinations of actions seemed to reduce the spread. Every observation was a delicate dance between ethical responsibility and the harsh reality of mortality. Anselm's discoveries extended beyond hygiene. He recognized the importance of distance, not in abstract theory, but in practical terms. Homes isolated from crowded markets or busy streets fared better than those in the bustling town center. Families that limited visitors or quarantined themselves within their homes were more likely to survive. These insights were revolutionary in a society that had no concept of germs. In effect, Anselm had stumbled upon the principles of quarantine and sanitation, practices that would only be codified centuries later. Tragically, much of Anselm's work remained hidden in monastery scrolls, ignored or lost in the tide of panic and superstition. It would take decades for others to rediscover these early lessons, yet the seeds were planted in those meticulous notes and observations. Brother Anselm's quiet dedication demonstrated that even in the darkest chapters of history, reason, observation, and careful attention could preserve life. By the time the plague's waves receded, Anselm had lost many friends, yet his monastery remained a sanctuary for knowledge. In the stories that survived, he was remembered not for miracles or prayers, but for his tireless attention to the details of life. A man who saw the invisible enemy not only as death, but as an opportunity for understanding. His work stands as a testament to the power of human curiosity and resilience. Even amidst chaos, insight can emerge, and small acts of observation can echo through history. As the Black Death swept mercilessly across Europe, its impact extended far beyond village streets and bustling markets. Entire kingdoms felt the weight of a crisis that no army, no treasury, and no throne could withstand. The plague, indiscriminate in its destruction, leveled nobles and peasants alike, toppling dynasties and shattering centuries of established power. The death of rulers, heirs, and advisors left vacuums that rippled across continents, forever altering the political landscape of Europe. In France, the royal court experienced a grim transformation. Advisors and high-ranking officials, who once orchestrated the kingdom's affairs with precision and pomp, fell ill one by one. King Philip VI watched helplessly as courtiers died in rapid succession, their once grand halls echoing with silence instead of laughter. The heir, a young prince scarcely old enough to understand the responsibilities of leadership, succumbed within weeks. Nobles vying for influence scrambled to fill the void, often fighting amongst themselves, while the plague advanced unabated. Governance crumbled not because of rebellion, But because the very architects of authority were gone, leaving decisions to the living few, overwhelmed by fear and mortality. In England, the story was equally dire. Lords of manors, responsible for administering justice, collecting taxes, and maintaining order, vanished overnight. Fields lay untilled, crops rotted in the ground, and villages fell into neglect. With the feudal system under unprecedented strain, peasants found themselves at a crossroads, bound to land that lacked oversight, yet increasingly valuable due to labor shortages. The balance of power, once firmly in the hands of the aristocracy, began to shift subtly but irrevocably. The plague did not merely kill people. It killed the structures that had defined their lives for generations. Northern kingdoms and the icy reaches of Scandinavia faced the same grim calculus. Monarchs huddled in fortified halls, believing that stone walls and armed guards could repel an enemy that was invisible, silent, and relentless. Yet no castle, however grand, could keep out fleas on rats or the contagion that traveled on merchants and messengers. Entire lines of succession were broken. Chronicles recount the sorrow of kings who buried their sons, daughters, and advisors within days of each other. Councils of war became moot. Alliances disintegrated under the strain of grief and fear. Nations, once confident in their borders and armies, learned a bitter lesson. Power could not defend against the microscopic terror of the Black Death. In Italy, city-states faced unique challenges. Republics like Florence and Venice depended on trade and diplomacy, yet every shipment, every caravan, became a potential vector for destruction. Civic leaders struggled to maintain order as death infiltrated councils, courts, and guilds. The streets, once vibrant with commerce, fell silent as plague claimed both merchants and magistrates alike. Wealth offered no immunity. Palaces emptied, guild halls closed, and the delicate mechanisms of urban governance ground to a halt. A fabric of society, carefully woven over centuries, frayed as leaders and laborers alike succumbed. The fall of kingdoms was not only political, but psychological. People who survived the initial waves of plague lived in a world where authority seemed powerless. Religious figures could not prevent death, nobles could not protect their lands, and monarchs could not ensure succession. Chaos reigned, often filled by fear-driven decisions that worsened the social fabric. Riots erupted in some towns. Mobs seized supplies and blamed outsiders for misfortune. The Black Death revealed the limits of human control, showing that even the most structured hierarchies were vulnerable to forces beyond comprehension. Yet, amid the collapse, seeds of transformation were planted. Labor shortages empowered the common people in ways previously unimaginable. Peasants who had survived demanded higher wages and better treatment. Cities, desperate to maintain some semblance of order, began experimenting with new governance strategies. The feudal order, once rigid and unyielding, began to evolve under the pressure of mortality. The plague's devastation, while horrific, catalyzed societal change, a rebirth born from death and disarray. By the time the plague subsided, the fall of kingdoms had reshaped Europe forever. Thrones were vacant, political hierarchies fractured, and the balance of power shifted irreversibly toward those who had survived. The Black Death proved that mortality was the ultimate equalizer, reminding rulers and commoners alike that wealth, walls, and armies could not shield them from nature's relentless hand. In the ashes of collapsed kingdoms, Europe began to rebuild, slowly, cautiously, but inevitably stronger for having faced one of history's most indiscriminate and transformative forces. In the shadow of the Black Death, Europe became a land both haunted and hallowed. Entire villages lay empty, churches overflowed with the dead, and streets once bustling with merchants, children, and livestock were now silent corridors of mortality. Amid this desolation, human nature revealed its duality, the capacity for both greed and profound courage, embodied in the contrasting figures of grave robbers and saints. As death mounted, Desperate and opportunistic individuals roamed the countryside, drawn to the morbid opportunities left by the plague. Grave robbers, often ordinary citizens driven by hunger or avarice, saw wealth among the dead. Jewelry buried with corpses, coins sewn into garments, and sacred relics from tombs became tempting prizes in a world where daily survival was uncertain. These men and women moved stealthily at night, guided by lanterns and hearsay, sometimes braving the wrath of fearful townsfolk or the perils of contagion itself. In their pursuit, they became almost spectral figures, slipping between the living and the dead, blurring the lines between survival and sin. Yet for every soul drawn to theft, there were those who risked life to perform acts of devotion and mercy. Across Europe, the saints of the Black Death emerged, ordinary people who confronted death directly to care for the dying, bury the bodies, or preserve sacred rites. Priests, nuns, and humble villagers faced the stench of decay and the certainty of infection without the protections now taken for granted. They entered plague-stricken homes, soothed the afflicted with water, herbs, and words of comfort, and carried bodies to graves that could not wait for proper ceremonies. Their bravery was quiet, unsung, and often fatal, yet it preserved the dignity of the dead and offered solace to the living. These contrasting roles, the robbers and the saints, revealed an unsettling truth. The Black Death did not discriminate between virtue and vice, nor did it diminish the moral choices imposed by circumstance. Both grave robbers and saints operated under the same oppressive weight of mortality. While one group profited or survived through cunning and audacity, the other endured suffering and risk in service of community and faith. Chroniclers of the time, writing in hushed tones amid fear, often juxtaposed these behaviors, creating legends that emphasized the thin line separating sin from heroism. Communities witnessed harrowing scenes that became ingrained in folklore and memory. Grave robbers were sometimes caught mid-act, confronted by surviving neighbors armed with pitchforks and desperation. Legends tell of stolen coins turning to ash in their hands, or spectral apparitions rising from the graves, punishing the greedy. Meanwhile, tales of saints circulated in hushed reverence. A young nun walking barefoot to the plague ward to comfort children, a blacksmith carrying a stretcher of bodies to the edge of a forest, a hermit dedicating weeks to digging graves in silence. These narratives became intertwined with local religious and cultural identity, blurring the boundary between historical fact and myth. The actions of both groups had unintended consequences as well. Grave robbers, by entering infected areas without precaution, often carried disease themselves, unknowingly accelerating contagion across towns. Saints, in their care and burial of victims, sometimes fell to the plague they sought to mitigate, becoming martyrs whose deaths were later memorialized in churches and manuscripts. Through these stories, the Black Death revealed not only the fragility of life, but also the interconnectedness of human behavior and disease, even if medieval Europeans did not understand the science behind it. Yet the presence of saints amidst the ruin offered hope. Their courage and compassion inspired surviving communities to persist, rebuild, and remember. They left behind tangible changes, organized burial practices, rudimentary sanitation efforts, and the moral understanding that society could endure if even a few individuals acted selflessly. In contrast, the exploits of grave robbers served as cautionary tales, reminding future generations of the destructive potential of greed when civilization falters. In this delicate balance of fear, devotion, and opportunism, Europe's character was forged anew. Grave robbers and saints, two extremes born from the same catastrophe, demonstrated the dual nature of humanity under pressure, capable of horror, yet also of extraordinary resilience. The Black Death did not only claim lives, it revealed the depths of human choice, showing that even amidst unparalleled devastation, actions, selfish or selfless, could ripple through history in ways far larger than individual survival. When the Black Death finally receded from a town, The silence that followed was profound, a silence that pressed upon the hearts of those who had lived while half of their neighbors, friends, and family had vanished. Survivors emerged into a world that was both familiar and alien. Streets were littered with abandoned belongings. Houses once full of laughter now stood empty, doors ajar, and hearths cold. In every town, the living were forced to reckon not only with the absence of the dead, but with the haunting knowledge that their survival had been, in large part, a matter of luck, timing, or simple happenstance. The emotional toll was immense. Families that had endured could no longer find normalcy in shared routines. Children wandered through villages searching for lost siblings or parents, while the elderly, who had outlived friends and neighbors alike, wrestled with sorrow and disorientation. Survivors were haunted by what historians now call survivor's guilt, a profound sense of unworthiness and responsibility. Why had they lived while others perished? Why had a neighbor fallen ill while they remained untouched? These questions had no answers, and yet the living could not escape them. Communities struggled to resume daily life. Markets reopened slowly, but the once thriving commerce was overshadowed by fear. Peasants who had lost entire extended families were left with labor shortages, fields that had gone untended, and livestock that had perished from neglect or infection. Urban centers, once hubs of wealth and activity, faced empty streets and ruined trade networks. Governance became an exercise in fragile hope. Councils and leaders were composed of the few who survived, often too traumatized to make decisions with clarity. Societies, in effect, had to rebuild from the ashes, navigating not only practical recovery, but the emotional aftermath of unprecedented loss. The survivor's psychological reckoning was also deeply personal. Some turned to faith, seeking solace in the idea that their survival had a divine purpose. Pilgrimages increased in some regions, and shrines dedicated to saints of the plagued were established. Prayer, which had often failed to prevent death during the epidemic, now became a ritual of gratitude and reflection. Others, however, sought answers outside the realm of religion. They observed patterns in the plague's spread, noting that cleanliness, isolation, and careful handling of the sick appeared to confer protection. These individuals sowed the earliest seeds of practical medicine and epidemiology, even if their understanding was rudimentary and fragmented. Stories emerged of miraculous survival, often blending fact and legend. A child who had wandered alone through abandoned villages, untouched by illness, was celebrated as chosen by fate. A merchant whose careful handling of cargo preserved both his goods and his family became a local hero. A midwife who maintained strict hygiene while tending to patients became revered as a quiet savior. Each tale contributed to the community's memory, shaping the moral and practical lessons that would guide Europe for generations. Yet the reckoning was not solely about admiration or guilt. Survivors wrestled with anger, grief, and even vengeance. They confronted those who had abandoned their families, traders who had spread infection, and those who had profited from others' suffering. Communities held trials, executed justice, or in some cases, succumbed to mob rule. The plague had shattered social norms, forcing survivors to navigate a landscape where moral certainties had been upended. Amid these trials, a subtle transformation took root. Labor shortages empowered the working class, as peasants and artisans became essential to rebuilding towns and cultivating fields. The social hierarchy, once rigid, began to bend under the weight of necessity. Survivors found that they had leverage previously unimaginable, a small compensation for the immeasurable losses they endured. Knowledge gleaned from observation, such as the benefits of clean water, separation of the sick, and attention to hygiene, began to influence daily life in practical ways, laying the groundwork for centuries of public health measures. The survivors' reckoning, ultimately, was a blend of sorrow, resilience, and reflection. They learned that life could persist even amidst chaos, that human ingenuity and compassion could save what raw luck could not, and that memory itself was both a burden and a tool. Europe, scarred by death, was slowly reborn. A continent reshaped not only by the disease, but by the choices, endurance, and reckoning of those who survived. In their courage, grief, and reflection, the seeds of a new world were sown, teaching humanity a lesson in both fragility and the indomitable will to endure. From the ruins left by the Black Death emerged a Europe profoundly altered, not just in population, but in society, economy, and culture. Cities once suffocated by overpopulation now found breathing room, fields long neglected slowly yielding crops once more, and surviving towns began the painstaking task of reconstruction. But the rebirth of Europe was not merely a return to what had been. It was the birth of something new, a continent reshaped by tragedy and forged by the lessons learned in the crucible of death. The demographic catastrophe created opportunities previously unimaginable. With half the population gone, labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants and commoners, who had been bound to the land with little agency, discovered newfound leverage. Lords, desperate to maintain production on their estates, were compelled to offer higher wages, better working conditions, and even more personal freedoms. The rigid feudal hierarchy, which had held sway for centuries, began to crumble under the weight of necessity. Survivors realized that life had changed irrevocably. The old rules could no longer be enforced when so many hands were lost and so many eyes had witnessed the fragility of life. In cities, the shift was equally transformative. Guilds and tradespeople, once constrained by strict apprenticeship rules and rigid social structures, found themselves in positions of relative power. Artisans could demand better compensation, and small business owners saw opportunities to expand markets now underserved by a depopulated workforce. Urban life adapted quickly, embracing efficiency and innovation as a necessity. Streets, once overcrowded and disease-ridden, began to see rudimentary sanitation practices emerge as citizens, scarred by first-hand experience, sought to prevent future devastation. Intellectually and culturally, the Black Death catalyzed a quiet revolution. The collapse of unquestioned religious authority, shaken by the inability of prayers, relics, and saints to halt the plague, opened minds to reason, observation, and inquiry. Scholars began to record, question, and analyze patterns in mortality, hygiene, and disease. Though germ theory was centuries away, the seeds of scientific thought were planted in the ashes of despair. Medicine began its slow evolution, informed by experience and the stark reality that empirical observation could save lives where superstition could not. Europe's art and literature also bore witness to this transformation. The morbid realities of life and death, so vividly experienced during the plague, inspired new forms of expression. Artists captured skeletal figures, graveyards, and the fleeting nature of human life with unprecedented intensity. Writers and chroniclers reflected on morality, mortality, and human resilience, creating works that resonated with a population intimately familiar with suffering. Through creativity, survivors processed trauma, honored the dead, and codified the lessons of survival into culture. Religion, too, adapted. Faith did not vanish, but it became more personal and reflective. Pilgrimages continued, but alongside acts of devotion arose practical approaches to living, care for the sick, attention to cleanliness, and community support. Spirituality and pragmatism began to coexist, forming the basis of a society that respected the divine, but also valued human agency. Monks who had survived the plague often became teachers, passing down not only religious texts, but practical knowledge gleaned from the disaster. Politically, the changes were far-reaching. Monarchies weakened, local authorities gained influence, and the balance of power shifted incrementally toward those who had survived and endured. Nations learned that resilience depended not on divine right or inherited privilege, but on adaptability, resource management, and human ingenuity. The old order, though not completely dismantled, was forever altered. Perhaps most importantly, the survivors carried forward the psychological and cultural memory of what they endured. Every village and city remembered the plague, the sudden emptiness, the bells tolling endlessly, the faces of neighbors lost. These memories shaped collective caution, inspired public health measures, and embedded a recognition of mortality into the consciousness of Europe. The Black Death, while a harrowing tragedy, became a catalyst for renewal. In death's shadow, humanity discovered resilience, innovation, and the beginnings of modernity. Europe, scarred and enlightened, rose from the devastation of the Black Death with a new sense of possibility. Society, labor, culture, and thought had all been transformed. From the ashes of mortality, a reborn continent emerged, wary, changed, yet infinitely capable of adaptation. The rebirth of Europe was not just survival. It was the triumph of humanity's will to endure, innovate, and thrive, even in the aftermath of a calamity that had seemed to promise nothing but oblivion. Even centuries after the Black Death had ebbed, its presence lingered in ways both subtle and profound. Europe had rebuilt, cities thrived, fields produced once more, and culture blossomed anew. But the shadow of the plague never truly vanished. It remained in the collective memory of societies, etched into folklore, art, literature, and the cautious habits of everyday life. The dead were gone, yet their legacy haunted the living, a constant reminder that life could be extinguished in an instant, and that human frailty was ever present. Communities remembered not only the tragedy, but the lessons learned. Survivors and their descendants carried with them stories of vigilance, of simple hygiene, of social responsibility. Wells were guarded, homes cleaned, and streets cautiously maintained. Festivals, once extravagant and carefree, incorporated rituals of remembrance. In every corner of Europe, the scars of history served as both a warning and a guide, shaping the rhythm of life and the expectations of mortality. Yet, beyond these practical lessons, the Black Death lingered in the psyche in ways less tangible, but no less powerful. Fear of disease became woven into the human experience, influencing behavior, governance, and culture. Literature brimmed with tales of pestilence and moral reckoning. Art depicted skeletons dancing among the living, reminding viewers of death's ubiquity. Music carried a somber undertone, a reflection of lives abruptly ended and communities forever altered. The shadow of the plague was psychological as well as physical, a ghost hovering over Europe's growth and transformation. The influence extended to knowledge itself. Physicians, scholars, and public officials retained an awareness of contagion, quarantine, and sanitation that informed policy for centuries. Even when the origin of disease was misunderstood, patterns were observed and recorded. Isolation could save lives, cleanliness mattered, and community coordination could prevent disaster. These early insights, born from horror and observation, became the foundation of what would eventually evolve into modern medicine and public health. The Black Death, though tragic, had forced humanity to consider its vulnerability in ways that science and society could no longer ignore. Cultural memory preserved darker, cautionary tales as well. Villages recounted stories of greed and recklessness, the merchants who concealed infected goods, the grave robbers who hastened contagion, as warnings of human folly. Simultaneously, the bravery and selflessness of those who risked their lives to care for the sick became legendary, immortalized in local histories and oral traditions. Europe remembered both its failures and its heroism, understanding that tragedy revealed the duality of human nature, capable of both destruction and profound compassion. Even in times of prosperity, the shadow returned whenever disease emerged. Subsequent plagues, smallpox, influenza, and other epidemics were always measured against the memory of the Black Death. People reacted with caution, fear, and preparedness, demonstrating the long-reaching impact of that catastrophic event. Every precaution, isolation, ritual cleansing, avoidance of strangers, was informed by centuries-old experience. The lessons of the 14th century were never forgotten, echoing through time like a whisper of warning from the past. And yet, for all its darkness, the Black Death's legacy was not solely despair. It catalyzed the evolution of society, reshaping labor, social structures, governance, and culture. It forced humanity to reckon with mortality, to innovate under pressure, and to value life in ways previously taken for granted. Its shadow, while a reminder of vulnerability, also served as a guide, a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the enduring will to survive. The story of the Black Death, therefore, did not end with the last toll of the bell or the burial of the final victim. It lived on in memory, in behavior, and in the very fabric of Europe itself. In the quiet moments of contemplation, in the careful practices of public health, and in the art, literature, and music of generations, the shadow of the plague whispered its eternal truth. Life is fragile, history is unrelenting, and humanity's endurance is both its greatest challenge and its most profound triumph. In every heartbeat, in every cautious step, the shadow of the Black Death never truly left, a reminder that the past is never past and that even the dead continue to shape the living. The Black Death reshaped Europe forever. From vanished villages to burned homes, from failed cures to the birth of modern hygiene, its shadow never truly left. Even today, the echoes of panic, fear, and survival whisper through history. Thank you for joining this journey through one of humanity's darkest hours. And remember, history isn't just dates and facts. It's the story of who we are when everything we know is threatened. Sleep well, dream of the past, and join us next time for another episode of Boring History to Sleep.